What's the worst trip you've ever been on? Lost luggage? A bad hotel? Try 75,000 miles across a medieval world with no antibiotics, where every meal is a gamble and every human interaction trades pathogens. This is the journey of Ibn Battuta, and it started with one terrible, naive idea. The Indian Ocean, 1345. A wooden ship is being torn apart by a cyclone. Ibn Battuta, a man who has already traveled farther than any human being you've ever met, is clinging to the shattered mast. He isn't thinking of the wonders of China or the courts of Delhi. He's thinking about the single, overwhelming fact that the water he's swallowing is a thick cocktail of seawater, his own vomit, and the diarrhea of 200 other passengers. This wasn't a journey of discovery. It was a 30-year subscription to a non-stop biohazard. We have this romantic image of the lone traveler, a figure of wisdom crossing silent deserts under starlit skies. Forget it. The reality for Ibn Battuta was a relentless assault of filth, disease, and discomfort across 75,000 miles. This is not the story of what he found. This is the story of what he survived. And to understand that survival, we have to start with the terrible, naive idea that set it all in motion. So picture Tangier in 1325. It's a comfortable port city on the Mediterranean. Ibn Battuta was 21 years old, from a family of legal scholars. He had a future, a nice, predictable life of studying Islamic law, maybe becoming a judge right there in his hometown. He had a home that didn't move, food that was familiar, and a bed that wasn't crawling with insects he'd never seen before. His plan was simple, almost modest. Make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. It was a rite of passage for a devout young man. He figured he'd be gone a year, maybe 2. He'd see Cairo, maybe Damascus, fulfill his religious duty, and come home with some good stories. He had no concept that he was about to embark on a 3-decade-long ordeal. The packing list was a lesson in tragic optimism. Some books, a change of clothes, a little money. He had no antibiotics, no insect repellent, no concept of germ theory. He was about to walk into a world where water was poison, food was a gamble, and every human interaction was a potential exchange of pathogens. The moment he walked out of the city gates, the romance died. The road wasn't a clean ribbon of earth. It was a cloud of fine, alkaline dust that got into everything. His eyes, his nose, his water sac. The security of walled cities was replaced by the constant, low-grade anxiety of bandits. The first night spent in a roadside caravanserai was his introduction to communal misery. A single room shared with merchants, their livestock, and the distinct aroma of unwashed feet and donkey. This was the first sensory shock. The world outside his comfortable scholarly bubble wasn't just new sights. It was new smells. The pungent odor of a camel train, the reek of a tannery on the outskirts of a town, the sweet, sickly smell of rotting fruit in a market. His body, accustomed to the relative cleanliness of Tangier, was now on high alert. Every itch, every rumble in his stomach was a warning sign. The first leg of the journey, up the North African coast toward Alexandria, was the practice run. It was comparatively easy, which is like saying a dull headache is better than a migraine. It set a dangerously false sense of security. He managed the coastal route. He survived the basic caravan life. He probably thought, I can handle this. He had no idea he was just dipping his toes into an ocean of suffering that stretched all the way to China. The real misery was waiting for him in the east, where the Black Death was already stirring, and the roads were paved with worse things than dust. The North African practice run. the coastal route along North Africa, was Ibn Battuta's tutorial in medieval travel misery. The Mediterranean might look beautiful from a distance, a sparkling blue expanse, but travelling alongside it meant dust, sun, and the constant gritty wind that sandblasted your skin. This was caravan travel, which sounds romantic until you realize it's just a slow-moving, open-air Petri dish. You're living in extreme close quarters with dozens of strangers and their animals. Your water ration is strictly limited, warm, and tastes of the animal skin container it's stored in. Personal space? Non-existent. You sleep on a thin mat laid directly on the ground, sharing body heat with the person next to you, along with whatever fleas or lice they've picked up. The food is a monotonous cycle of hardtack, dates, and a bland, grainy porridge called pottage, a medieval smoothie you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. This is where he encountered his first unfamiliar illnesses: a strange fever, a persistent cough, a stomach bug that left him weak for days. The treatments were as bad as the diseases. Herbal remedies of questionable efficacy, or the medieval cure-all: bloodletting. Congratulations, you're no longer just sick, you're sick and anemic. There were brief respites, tiny oases of civilization that made the hardship seem almost worthwhile. In Tunis, he experienced the legendary hospitality offered to travelling scholars: a real house with walls, a proper meal, the luxury of a conversation that wasn't shouted over the braying of donkeys. For a night, he could almost forget the filth, but that was the trap. These moments of comfort were just punctuation in a long, run-on sentence of discomfort. They made the return to the road even more jarring. The slow realization dawned on him that this journey, even just to Mecca, was going to be nothing like the spiritual adventure he'd imagined. It was a slow-motion endurance test against dirt, disease, and exhaustion. The practice run was over. He arrived in Egypt, the gateway to the real East, thinking he was a seasoned traveler. He'd survived North Africa. He had no idea that everything he'd experienced so far was just the tutorial level. The game was about to get much, much harder. Alexandria wasn't just another city. It was an introduction to a scale of urban filth he could not yet comprehend. And then he saw it. Alexandria. The legendary city wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a sensory overload that hit you before you even passed through the gates. The first thing that registered wasn't the sight of the great walls or the famous lighthouse in the distance. It was the smell. A complex, layered stench carried on the sea breeze. A thick combination of salt air, rotting fish from the harbour, exotic spices from the warehouses, and the unmistakable pungent odour of an open sewer, servicing a population of hundreds of thousands. This was the grandeur of the Mamluk Empire, and it had a very distinct, very unpleasant aroma. The city itself was a marvel of human achievement built on a foundation of pure filth. The harbour was a churning soup of human activity and waste. Ships from every corner of the known world disgorged their cargo and their bilge water into the same space where sewage from the city drained. The water was a murky brown, glittering with a sinister sheen. The streets were narrow, labyrinthine canyons where sunlight rarely touched the ground, which was often just compacted garbage and mud. The constant noise was a cacophony of shouting merchants, braying pack animals, and the calls to prayer, all echoing off the close walls. It was a place where you could see unimaginable wealth in the silks of a passing merchant, and, in the same glance, a child sleeping in a gutter. He did find one moment of pure, unadulterated wonder. The lighthouse of Alexandria. Even in its partially ruined state, it was a breathtaking sight. For a few minutes, standing there, looking out at the Mediterranean, He could forget the grime, the scale of it, the engineering. It was a reminder of human genius, a brief, clean interlude in the otherwise grubby narrative of his journey. But the real world quickly intruded. In the markets, in the crowded inns, he began to hear whispers. A word passed between merchants with worried looks. Taun, pestilence. There were stories coming from the east, from the trading ports along the Silk Road, of a sickness unlike any other, a plague that was wiping out entire towns. It was just a rumor, a shadow on the horizon, but it hung in the air of Alexandria as palpably as the smell of fish. This wasn't just a gateway to the wonders of the East. It was the antechamber to a coming apocalypse. The journey down the Nile to Cairo was no longer just the next leg of a pilgrimage. It felt like a journey into a gathering storm. If Alexandria was a warning, Cairo was the main event. It was the largest city in the entire Islamic world, a metropolis so vast it made everywhere else he'd been look like a village. The sheer scale was the first assault, a sprawling, chaotic maze of humanity that stretched as far as the eye could see. But the scale wasn't the real problem. The problem was what that many people produced. The noise was a constant, deafening roar. The markets were a sensory overload of spices, perfumes, animals, and the thick, sweet smell of unwashed humanity packed shoulder to shoulder under the blazing sun. And then there was the Nile. From a distance, it was the lifeblood of Egypt, a majestic ribbon of blue cutting through the desert. Up close, it was something else entirely. It was the city's drinking fountain, its bathtub, its laundry, and its open sewer, all flowing together in one muddy, sluggish current. The water that people drank, that they cooked with, was the same water that carried away the waste of millions. Dysentery wasn't an occasional risk. It was a fact of life. Your body was in a constant low-grade war with the environment. In this world of overwhelming filth, there was one true oasis, the public bathhouse, or hammam. For a traveller like Ibn Battuta, this wasn't a luxury, it was a medical necessity. You'd enter a world of steam and tile, a place dedicated to the radical idea of getting clean. The ritual was a brief, glorious reprieve from the grime. You'd sweat out the dirt in the hot room, be scrubbed raw by an attendant with a coarse mitt, and emerge feeling like a new man, for a few hours at least. It was the only place where the layers of travel, the dust, the sweat, the grime of 100 different roads, could be temporarily stripped away. This created a stark contrast that defined life in Cairo. You could pray in the most opulent mosques, their marble floors cool and clean, then step outside into streets running with refuse. You could be a guest in a wealthy merchant's home, surrounded by silk cushions and intricate tile work, and know that just outside the door, people were dying from illnesses borne by the very air and water. The medical care available was a terrifying blend of ancient knowledge and pure superstition. If you got seriously sick, your options were bloodletting to balance your humours, or cauterization with a hot iron to seal wounds. It was a world where a simple cut could be a death sentence. It was here, surrounded by both immense grandeur and profound squalor, that Ibn Battuta made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of his life. He had reached a major crossroads. The sensible path was to join a Hajj caravan south to Mecca, fulfill his pilgrimage, and turn for home. But the road had already gotten its hooks into him. The misery was addictive in its own way. So he chose the path of greater uncertainty. Instead of heading directly to Arabia, he decided to take a massive detour, first traveling north through Syria and Palestine. It was a choice that would expose him to political instability, bandit-infested roads, and a preview of the even greater cultural shocks that lay ahead. The comfort of a known destination was traded for the unknown, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again until he was a world away from the young scholar who had left Tangier. So Ibn Battuta turned north, away from the direct route to Mecca, and headed into the Levant. This wasn't just a detour, it was a choice to wander through a political powder keg. The region was a patchwork of Crusader remnants, Mamluk governors, and local warlords, all vying for control. The roads were less traveled for a reason. They were dangerous. Every hill could hide a bandit ambush, and every friendly local could be sizing you up for a quick robbery. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. Barren hills, deep wadis, and long stretches of exposed rock under a relentless sun. There was nowhere to hide. But then, in the middle of this tense journey, he found a moment of pure, unexpected peace. A remote Sufi lodge. These were way stations for mystics and travelers, often built around a spring or an ancient tree. Here, the rules of the road didn't apply. He was welcomed not as a source of profit or suspicion, but as a guest. There was simple, clean food, bread, olives, maybe some yogurt. There was quiet conversation and the sound of prayer, not the constant jangle of harnesses and the fear of an attack. It was a brief, powerful reminder of the spiritual community he was supposedly traveling to find, a calm interlude that reset his soul before the next leg of misery. This part of the journey was also a preview of the profound cultural shocks to come. The food was different. Tabouleh, full mesdames, flavors his Moroccan palate wasn't ready for. The customs were different. The way people prayed, the way they bargained in markets, even the architecture of the villages felt alien. He was still in the Islamic world, but the unity was superficial. The local realities were 1,000 small differences he had to navigate every day. And then he reached Jerusalem, the spiritual climax for so many pilgrims. But the sanctity of the city was surrounded by the brutal reality of medieval pilgrimage. The streets around the holy sites were a chaotic, stinking mess of thousands of travelers, all crammed into inadequate hostels. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was a marvel, but the air inside was thick with the smell of sweat, candle smoke, and unwashed bodies. It was a place of profound faith built on a foundation of pure, physical filth. He performed his prayers, but the experience was as much about endurance as it was about devotion. Turning south from Jerusalem, the goal was finally in sight, joining the great Hajj caravan assembling in Damascus. But this wasn't a triumphant march toward a spiritual finish line. It was a weary trudge into the ultimate test of medieval travel. The relative solitude of the Syrian road was about to be replaced by the concentrated communal suffering of thousands of pilgrims packed together for a months-long march across the desert. The personal discomfort he'd endured so far was just a warm-up. The real biohazard event was waiting for him in Damascus. Damascus was the final staging ground, the place where the abstract idea of a pilgrimage collided with the brutal logistics of moving tens of thousands of people across a desert. The city wasn't just crowded, it was a pressure cooker. Every inn, every stable, every patch of open ground was occupied by pilgrims from every corner of the earth. North Africa, Persia, Anatolia, Central Asia. The air was thick with 12 different languages and the constant low hum of anxiety. This wasn't a spiritual gathering. It was the assembly of a mobile city, one with no sanitation department and a very strict, very brutal departure schedule. The caravan had a strict hierarchy of misery. The wealthy and powerful traveled in enclosed litters carried by camels, shaded from the sun, insulated from the worst of the dust. For everyone else, it was on foot. You walked, for months, through the blistering heat of the Arabian desert, your feet sinking into the fine, choking dust with every step. Your world shrank to the back of the person in front of you, the burning sensation on your neck, and the overwhelming thirst. Your daily water ration was a cruel joke, just enough to keep you from dying of dehydration, never enough to feel satisfied. It was a carefully measured dose of survival. The daily routine was a form of slow torture. You'd be woken hours before dawn, when the air was still cold, to pack up and start moving. The goal was to cover as much ground as possible before the sun reached its peak and turned the desert into an oven. There was no stopping for a leisurely lunch. You ate what you could while walking, a handful of dates, a piece of dry bread. The caravan didn't stop for your discomfort. If you fell behind, you were left. The desert was littered with the bones of those who couldn't keep up. At night, the city would set up camp, and this was where the biohazard reached its peak. Imagine a sea of thousands of people and animals all crammed together in a makeshift encampment with no infrastructure. There were no latrines. You just found a spot away from the tents, which, with thousands of people, wasn't very far away at all. The ground was the toilet. The air at night was thick with the smoke of cooking fires and the stench of human and animal waste. This was the perfect breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, typhoid, any communicable illness you can imagine would rip through the exhausted, malnourished crowd with terrifying speed. A cough in the morning could be a death rattle by nightfall. Yet, amidst this profound physical suffering, there were moments of powerful shared purpose. The rituals of prayer, performed together in the vast emptiness of the desert, created a bond that transcended the filth and the fear. For a few minutes at dawn and dusk, the grumbling of stomachs and the aches of bodies were silenced by a collective focus on something greater. These were the calm interludes, the reason they were all enduring this hell. It was a glimpse of the spiritual purity they were seeking, a stark contrast to the physical degradation of the journey itself. Finally, after weeks of this relentless march, they reached Mecca. But the arrival wasn't a triumphant climax. It was a shift from one form of endurance to another. The rituals of the Hajj themselves are physically demanding, circumambulating the Kaaba, running between the hills of Safa and Marwa, and he performed them in a state of near delirium from heat stroke and exhaustion, surrounded by a crushing, suffocating crowd of hundreds of thousands. The spiritual goal was achieved, but the body was broken. And now, standing in the holy city, Ibn Battuta faced the question every pilgrim faces: do you go home? For him, the road had become an addiction. The misery was familiar now. The thought of returning to the quiet, predictable life of a scholar in Tangier felt small. So he made the decision that would seal his fate for the next 25 years. He wouldn't go west toward home. He would go east, deeper into the unknown, straight toward the gathering storm of the Black Death. The pilgrimage was over. The real journey was just beginning. So Ibn Battuta turned his back on the relative safety of the Arabian heartland and headed east, directly into the gathering storm. The rumors he'd heard in Alexandria and Damascus were no longer whispers. They were the dominant topic of conversation in every caravanserai. The air itself felt different, thick with a palpable fear. This was no longer just a journey through difficult terrain. It was a journey through a landscape beginning to die. Traveling through Iraq and Persia as the Black Death began its sweep was like watching a slow-moving catastrophe in real time. You'd approach a town that was supposed to be a bustling trade center, only to find an eerie silence. Gates might be barred, with guards turning you away, their faces wrapped in cloth. Or worse, you'd find the gates open and the town hollowed out. Streets that should have been teeming with life were empty, save for the occasional feral dog or the distant sound of a lone mourner. The markets were deserted, shops abandoned with their wares still inside. The plague moved faster than news, so you never knew what you were walking into. One day, you're sharing a meal with a merchant. The next day, you hear his entire caravan was wiped out a week's journey back. Death became his constant, unwelcome traveling companion. He wouldn't just hear about it, he would see it. Bodies left in the streets because there was no one left to bury them. The ghastly sight of the buboes, the swollen, blackened lymph nodes that gave the disease its name. The medieval mind had no framework for this. Their quarantine measures were a desperate mix of practical isolation and pure superstition. They might burn aromatic woods to purify the air, or recite prayers, all while the real threat was in the fleas jumping from the rats that travelled with the caravans, the very caravans that were the lifeblood of the region. He was witnessing a complete societal breakdown, a world losing its mind to terror. There was a futile attempt at a calm interlude in the city of Shiraz, famous for its poets and its beautiful gardens. He visited one, a shaded paradise of cypress trees and flowing water channels, a place designed for peace. But the beauty was utterly overshadowed. The garden felt like a fragile illusion, a manicured piece of order in a world succumbing to chaos. You could sit by a pond and try to appreciate the perfection of a rose, but your mind would wander to the empty houses just beyond the wall, to the families that were no longer there to enjoy it. The tranquility was haunted. The psychological toll of moving through this dying world was immense. Every new person you met was a potential source of infection. Every handshake, every shared cup of water was a gamble. The trust that makes travel possible was eroding. The famous hospitality of the East was being replaced by suspicion and fear. You weren't a guest, you were a threat. The journey became a tense, paranoid slog, where the goal was no longer discovery, but simply to keep moving, to outrun the shadow that was consuming the land behind you. The romantic quest for knowledge had mutated into a grim survival horror. Pushing further north, he was seeking refuge, some semblance of order. His path led him toward the lands of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol empire that controlled Persia. Their reputation for brutal efficiency, for imposing a harsh peace known as the Pax Mongolica, suddenly seemed appealing. In a world falling apart, the rigid, unforgiving control of the Mongols promised something that had become precious: stability. It was a desperate hope that the very force that had terrified the world for a century might now be the only thing that could save a part of it from annihilation. He was trading the chaos of a natural disaster for the cold, calculated order of an empire, hoping that behind their walls, the dying would at least be orderly. And then he crossed into the lands of the Ilkhanate, and the world shifted. After the chaotic disintegration of plague-ravaged Persia, the Mongol-controlled territories felt unnervingly calm. It was the difference between a riot and a military occupation. The roads, famously, were safe. The Pax Mongolica wasn't a gentle peace. It was a peace enforced by the very real threat of horrific violence against anyone who disrupted trade. For a traveller, this was a bizarre kind of relief. The constant low-grade fear of bandits was gone. It was replaced by the sight of Mongol patrols, stern-faced riders who viewed you not as a person, but as a moving component of the empire's economic machine. You were safe, in the same way a package in a well-run logistics network is safe. He reached the court of the Il Khan, Abu Sa'id, and witnessed the empire in its final glittering days. There was still immense wealth on display, silks, jewels, elaborate court ceremonies, but it was like a gilded mask on a dying face. The power of the Mongols was fracturing from within, and the plague was accelerating the decay. The court was a bubble of fragile order, a last bastion of civilization trying to pretend the apocalypse wasn't happening just beyond the city walls. You could feast on roasted lamb in a marble hall, while knowing that in the outer districts, bodies were still being collected. This relative safety allowed him to travel through regions like Azerbaijan, but it introduced a new kind of misery: climate. After the blistering heat of Arabia and the plague spring of Persia, he now faced the bitter, penetrating cold of the Armenian highlands and the snows of the Caucasus. His thin North African robes were useless. Frostbite became a new threat to add to his list. The comfort of a caravanserai now meant a desperate huddle around a smoky fire, trying to thaw limbs that had gone numb on horseback. There was a calm interlude in the city of Tabriz, a major Mongol capital. He visited the famous Blue Mosque, a breathtaking masterpiece covered in intricate cobalt blue tiles that seemed to shimmer in the sun. For a moment, standing under its majestic dome, the misery of the road faded. This was human achievement on a scale that could rival the pyramids. The precision of the patterns, the sheer artistry, was a defiant statement against the chaos outside. It was a reminder that beauty could still be created, even as the world seemed to be ending. But the interlude was brief. The stability of the Ilkhanate, while welcome, was ultimately a dead end for a traveler with no official role. He was just another scholar passing through. The road was calling again, but now with a more practical purpose. The money he'd started with was dwindling. The romantic notion of endless wandering was crashing into the reality that he needed to eat. So he made a fateful decision, one that would lead him into the most challenging chapter of his entire journey. He would seek employment. He'd use his credentials as a legal scholar to find a position at a court. And the richest, most powerful, and most volatile court in the entire region was that of the Sultan of Delhi. It promised wealth and prestige. What it delivered was a gilded cage of paranoia and terror, a descent into a different kind of hell altogether. The relative order of the Mongols was about to be traded for the unpredictable nightmare of the Delhi Sultanate. So he turned his back on the relative order of the Mongol world and pointed himself toward the ultimate prize, the fabulously wealthy Delhi Sultanate. The journey there was a brutal physical descent into a new world of misery. The route took him through the jagged, unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan and across the Hindu Kush. These weren't hills, they were colossal walls of rock and ice. The passes were so high the air was thin, leaving him gasping and dizzy with altitude sickness. The paths were narrow, treacherous ledges, where a single misstep could send you plummeting 1,000 feet. In the winter, the threat wasn't just the drop. It was avalanches that could bury an entire caravan in seconds, leaving no trace behind. The landscape was a study in cruel contrasts. You'd be freezing in a snowstorm one day, then baking in the dry, dusty heat of a high-altitude plateau the next. The views were breathtakingly beautiful, snow-capped peaks against impossibly blue skies. But that beauty was purely for the birds. For a traveler, every stunning vista was just another obstacle, another mile of agony between you and your destination. Your body ached from the constant climbing. Your lungs burned from the thin air, and your mind was frayed by the relentless, life-threatening exposure. And then finally, you'd cross a pass, and the world would change. The air grew thick and humid. The smells changed from clean, cold stone to the rich, rotting scent of dense vegetation. The sounds of mountain wind were replaced by the shrieks of unfamiliar birds and the constant buzz of insects. He was entering the Indian subcontinent, and it was a sensory shock as profound as any plague. This was a land of overwhelming life, and all of it seemed designed to make a human uncomfortable. The food was spiced with flavors that scorched his North African palate. The customs were entirely alien. He was now a complete outsider, and the road had never felt more lonely or dangerous. The tales he heard at campfires were no longer about Mongol patrols, but about the immense wealth and the terrifying, unpredictable temper of the Sultan of Delhi. He was trading the known dangers of mountains and plague for the unknown, psychological terror of a volatile court. He arrived at the Indus River, the symbolic gateway to India, not as a conquering hero, but as a weary, broke, and increasingly anxious man, about to walk into a gilded cage. Crossing the Indus River felt like stepping into another universe. The air was thick, heavy with a humidity his body had never known. And then he saw it. Delhi. Not a city, but a fortress. Immense, red sandstone walls that seemed to go on forever, projecting an aura of pure, unassailable power. This was the court of Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and it was the richest, most terrifying place Ibn Battuta would ever set foot in. The wealth was staggering. He was appointed a qadi, a judge, and suddenly he was living in opulence he couldn't have imagined in Tangier. There were feasts with dozens of dishes, gardens with elaborate fountains, palaces cooled by wet, fragrant screens. But the luxury was a trap. The Sultan was famously volatile, a man of immense learning and even greater paranoia. A wrong word, a misinterpreted glance, could mean a death sentence. You could be enjoying a plate of sweet mangoes one moment and be dragged to the execution grounds the next. The fear was a constant low hum in the background of every conversation, a taste of metal underneath the sweetest foods. The climate itself was a form of torture. The suffocating heat of the plains was bad enough, but then came the monsoon. The rains would bring a temporary relief from the heat, but they also brought a new wave of misery. Stagnant water pooled everywhere, becoming breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The air would fill with clouds of insects, and with them came fevers, malaria, dengue, that would lay low even the strongest men. The palaces might have been cool, but the city outside was a steaming disease swamp for months on end. There was a calm interlude, though, in the intellectual life of the court. For a scholar like Ibn Battuta, the debates on law and theology provided a temporary anchor. It was a world he understood, a familiar language in a place where everything else felt alien and threatening. For a few hours, surrounded by books and learned men, he could almost forget he was a prisoner in a gilded cage, his life dependent on the whims of a mentally unstable ruler. That anchor couldn't hold forever. The Sultan's favor was as reliable as the monsoon winds. What was given could be taken away in an instant, and for Ibn Battuta, that instant came when the Sultan decided to bestow a great honor upon him. He was appointed an ambassador, tasked with leading a delegation to the court of the Chinese emperor. On the surface, it was a prestigious mission. In reality, everyone knew it was a one-way ticket. It was a death sentence disguised as a promotion, a polite way of exiling a courtier who had outlived his usefulness. The relief of leaving the oppressive palace was immediately replaced by the terror of the road ahead. He was being sent on a diplomatic mission through some of the most dangerous territory in the world, with a target on his back from the moment he left the city gates. The cage door had opened, only to lead him into a different kind of trap, so the honor was bestowed. Ibn Battuta was to be the Sultan's ambassador to the court of the Chinese emperor. On paper, it was a position of immense prestige. In reality, it was a beautifully wrapped death sentence. The Sultan's court was a nest of vipers, and this mission was the most elegant way to remove someone without the messy business of a public execution. He was being sent on a journey of thousands of miles through some of the most dangerous territory on earth, with a target on his back from the moment he left the city. The gilded cage was opening, but only to release him into the jaws of a predator. A massive caravan was assembled for the journey, soldiers for protection, servants, and a small fortune in gifts for the Chinese emperor. Jewels, fine textiles, exotic animals. It was an impressive display of the Sultan's wealth, a traveling target for every bandit and warlord between Delhi and the coast. The departure was a surreal mix of relief and terror. Relief to be free of the suffocating paranoia of the court. Terror at the sheer scale of the suicide mission he was now leading. He was riding away from one certain death toward a dozen probable ones. The freedom lasted for a matter of days. Barely outside the relative safety of the Sultan's lands, the caravan was ambushed. It wasn't a random bandit attack. It was a coordinated assault by Hindu rebels fighting against Tughlaq's rule. And Ibn Battuta, as the Sultan's representative, was the prize. The scene was pure chaos. The soldiers were overwhelmed. The valuable gifts were the first things looted. He was separated from the group, captured, stripped of everything he owned. His robes, his money, even the shoes on his feet. The respected Qadi, the Sultan's ambassador, was suddenly a naked, bleeding prisoner in the wilderness, certain he was about to have his throat slit. But then, a bizarre and desperate calm interlude. Instead of killing him, the rebel chief, intrigued by this foreign scholar, showed him a strange kindness. He was given simple clothes, some food, and eventually his freedom. It was an act of mercy that made no sense in the brutal calculus of the region's politics. Perhaps the chief saw him as a pawn, or perhaps it was just a whim. For Ibn Battuta, shivering and destitute, it was a second lease on a life that had seemed finished just hours before. He was alive, but he had nothing. The grand diplomatic mission was in ruins. The soldiers were dead or scattered. The gifts were gone. He was a failed ambassador, a man with no money, no patron, and no way home. All he had left was the road itself, and the stubborn, maybe foolish decision to keep moving forward. His official mission to China was over. Now it was just a personal quest, a solitary trudge toward the coast, with nothing but his wits and a story of spectacular failure. Alone and destitute, Ibn Battuta's only option was to push south toward the Malabar coast, a region whose beauty was a complete and utter lie. The landscape was a lush, green nightmare of dense jungle and palm trees, all shrouded in a blanket of oppressive, wet heat that never lifted. The air was so thick with humidity you could drink it, and it left a permanent film of sweat and grime on your skin that no amount of wiping could clear. This wasn't the dry heat of the desert. This was a slow cooker that bred mold on your clothes, rot on your leather, and a spectacular array of fungal infections in places you didn't even know could get itchy. The coast itself was dominated by a series of small, warring Hindu kingdoms and a thriving industry of piracy. The ports were chaotic, dangerous places where the law was whatever the local Raja decided it was that day. The smell was a unique coastal cocktail of salt, drying fish, coconut husks, and the distinct sweet-sour odor of toddy, a fermented palm wine that seemed to be the primary local export. He was completely out of his element, a Muslim scholar adrift in a world of unfamiliar gods, strange customs, and a social hierarchy he couldn't begin to navigate. The food was a constant source of distress. While he was used to the flatbreads and stews of the Muslim world, here everything was rice, fish, and coconut, often cooked with a terrifying amount of spice that felt like a physical assault on his palate. He was starving, but every meal was a traumatic experience. And the monsoons. The monsoons were a seasonal apocalypse. The skies would open for weeks on end, turning paths into knee-deep rivers of mud, flooding the flimsy shelters, and creating a world of damp, miserable stagnation where nothing ever dried. There was a brief, fleeting calm interlude out on the water. He managed to secure passage on a dhow, one of the elegant wooden sailing ships that plied the Indian Ocean. For a few days, the misery of the coast faded. There was the rhythmic creak of the timbers, the snap of the lateen sail, and the vast, empty horizon. It was a taste of the ancient maritime trade routes that connected the world, a reminder that movement was still possible, even graceful, away from the slog of overland travel. It was from the deck of that ship that he first saw them, a string of tiny, perfect green islands set in impossibly blue water, the Maldives. After months of jungle, pirates, and relentless damp, it looked like a mirage of paradise. The local sailors told him stories of easy living, of friendly people, and of peace. To a man who had just lost everything, his wealth, his status, his mission, it sounded like salvation. It was the most logical, most terrible decision he could make. He decided to detour from his fractured mission and go there, seeking refuge. He was trading the known miseries of the coast for the unknown, deceptive peace of a tropical prison. He had no idea that the most beautiful place he would ever see was about to become the hardest to escape. So his escape from the Maldives was a diplomatic masterstroke, trading his judge's robes for a ship's deck. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't done punishing him for his ambition. The voyage toward Sri Lanka, which was supposed to be the next logical step toward China, lasted barely a day before the skies turned black. This wasn't a squall. It was a full-blown monsoon tempest. The dhow, which had seemed so elegant in calm waters, was now a toy in the hands of a furious ocean. The wooden planks groaned under the strain, the sail tore to shreds, and seawater poured over the sides. The terror was absolute. After all the political maneuvering to get free, he was now facing a much simpler, more final end: drowning. The ship didn't just take on water, it broke apart. The sound of the mast snapping was like a gunshot, and then he was in the churning black water. He lost everything. Again. The few possessions he'd managed to accumulate in the Maldives, any money, his writing, all of it was gone to the depths. He washed ashore on the Coromandel coast of India, not as a scholar or a judge or an ambassador, but as a piece of human driftwood. He was bruised, half drowned, and completely destitute. The grand plan to reach China was now a sick joke. He was back at square one, but with even less than he'd started with. And then came the betrayal. The local Hindu rulers, finding this bedraggled foreigner on their beach, saw him not as a victim to be helped, but as an opportunity. They helped him, gave him shelter, and then systematically stripped him of the last things he had, the clothes on his back. He was robbed by the very people who offered him aid. This was a new low. In the desert, bandits were an expected hazard, but this was a calculated, humiliating theft from those posing as rescuers. The scholar from Tangier was now literally naked and starving on a foreign shore. A man with nothing left but his own stubborn will to survive. This was arguably the lowest point of his entire 30-year journey. He was reduced to begging. A man who had debated law in the court of the Sultan of Delhi was now holding out his hand for scraps of food from villagers who viewed him as a strange, pathetic curiosity. The gap between his former status and his current reality was so vast, it was almost funny, in the most bitterly cynical way. The road had taken everything from him, piece by piece, until he was just a hollowed-out shell of a man. But even here, at rock bottom, there was a fleeting calm interlude. A poor fisherman's family, with nothing to gain, took pity on him. They didn't see a strange Muslim or a potential source of profit. They saw a fellow human being in desperate need. They gave him simple, coarse clothing and a bowl of rice. It was a tiny, profound act of kindness in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty and opportunism. It was enough to keep a spark of life flickering. That spark was fanned into a flame of pure, stubborn resolve. He had lost his mission, his wealth, his dignity, and nearly his life. But the original goal, China, remained. It was no longer about fulfilling a sultan's command or seeking fortune. It had become a purely personal quest, a matter of principle. He would not let the road defeat him. He would continue, not as an ambassador, but as a ghost, a man with nothing left to lose, pushing eastward simply because turning back was no longer an option. The mission to China was dead, but the need to see it for himself was now the only thing keeping him alive. So he began again, for what felt like the 100th time. He was a ghost of a traveler now, working his way onto a ship heading for Southeast Asia. This wasn't a grand diplomatic vessel. It was a trading ship, a floating petri dish of human misery. The Indian Ocean was a different kind of desert, vast, empty, and just as unforgiving. The ship was cramped, with passengers and crew packed together on the open deck, exposed to the sun by day and the cold sea spray by night. The food was a monotonous ration of hardtack and dried fish, and the water, stored in wooden casks, was warm and tasted strongly of wood and algae. The real horror, though, was the lack of movement. On land, even in the worst conditions, you could put one foot in front of the other. At sea, you were trapped. Seasickness was a constant for many, and the stench of vomit mixed with the smell of brine and unwashed bodies created a unique maritime biohazard. The journey was a slow, sickening crawl across the map. They made landfall in places like Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, and each port was a new lesson in alien cultures. The sights were strange and wonderful, dense jungles, bustling ports filled with spices he'd never smelled before. But the underlying reality was the same relentless struggle. The constant, oppressive humidity of the tropics was a given, and everywhere the threat of pirates. The Strait of Malacca was infamous for it. Sleek, fast vessels could appear on the horizon at any moment, turning a trading ship into a prize. Every sail was a potential threat, and the tension was a constant companion. There was a calm interlude, though, in the sheer, raw power of the landscape. Sailing through the Indonesian archipelago, they passed active volcanoes, their peaks wreathed in smoke, a reminder of the immense geological forces that had shaped this part of the world. At night, under a sky impossibly dense with unfamiliar stars, the sea would sometimes glow with bioluminescence, the ship's wake a trail of liquid light. For a moment, the misery of the journey would fade, replaced by a sense of awe at the scale of the planet he was traversing. Finally, the destination was in sight. He transferred to a massive Chinese junk for the final leg north. These ships were technological marvels, far larger and more sophisticated than the dhows of the Indian Ocean. They had multiple decks, watertight compartments, and could carry hundreds of people. But a bigger ship just meant a larger, more organized version of the same floating misery. The food was still terrible, the water still questionable, and you were now sharing your limited space with an even greater number of strangers. But this was it, the end of the line. After 30 years of deserts, plagues, shipwrecks, and betrayals, he was about to step into a civilization more alien, more orderly, and in its own way, more isolating than any he had encountered. The journey was almost over. The destination was about to reveal itself. The ship docked at Quanzhou, which the Arab traders called Zaitun, and Ibn Battuta stepped into a world that made even the grandeur of Delhi feel provincial. This was the absolute edge of the known world, and it was nothing like he'd imagined. The shock wasn't one of squalor or danger, but of a civilization so advanced, so orderly, and so utterly alien that he was rendered a complete outsider. After decades of navigating cultures that shared some thread of the Islamic world, he was now in a place where nothing was familiar. The order was the first thing that struck him. The streets were paved and clean, a stark contrast to the open sewers of Cairo or the muddy tracks of India. The port was a forest of masts, with enormous Chinese junks dwarfing the ships he'd known. The wealth was immense, but it was a quiet, organized wealth, not the ostentatious display of a sultan's court. The sheer scale of everything was humbling, and the strangeness was in the details. The architecture was all swooping roofs and intricate woodwork, nothing like the domes and arches of the West. The food was a universe of unfamiliar textures and flavors, noodles, soy, and dishes that bore no resemblance to the spiced meats and flatbreads of his homeland. The people wore silk robes of a cut he'd never seen. Their writing was a beautiful, incomprehensible script of brushstrokes. Their customs, from tea ceremonies to the way they conducted business, were a complete mystery. Even the sounds were different. The language was a tonal melody that held no meaning for his ears. He was more of a foreigner here than he had been anywhere else. He travelled north along the Grand Canal, a man-made waterway that was a marvel of engineering, a highway of commerce stretching for hundreds of miles. It was a breathtaking achievement, but for a traveller, it was just another route of filth. The canal was the lifeblood of the empire, which meant it was also its main sewer. The water was a murky, sluggish flow, carrying the waste of every town it passed. The boats were crowded, the journey was slow, and the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and human habitation. The grandeur of the achievement couldn't mask the fundamental, miserable reality of pre-modern travel. He reached the Mongol capital of Khanbalik, what we now call Beijing, and witnessed the absolute peak of Mongol power. The city was vast, its walls even more imposing than Delhi's. Here was the court of the Great Khan, the ruler who held sway over the largest land empire in history. But for Ibn Battuta, it was a disappointment. He found only a small, isolated community of Muslim traders. He was a nobody here. His credentials as a scholar meant nothing in a court that followed entirely different traditions. The grand mission that had started in Delhi was a distant, failed memory. He had reached the end of the earth, and there was nothing for him to do. There was a calm interlude, though, in the sheer artistry of Chinese civilization. He marveled at the porcelain, a ceramic so fine and white it seemed like solidified milk. He touched silk fabrics of a quality that made the finest Persian textiles feel coarse. This was a culture that had perfected things his own world was only beginning to understand. For a moment, he could appreciate the beauty humans were capable of creating, even at the far end of the world. But that appreciation was overshadowed by a profound and growing homesickness. The novelty had worn off. The alien nature of everything, which had once been a thrill, was now just exhausting. He realized that after 30 years, the journey was over. There was no more east to go. He had seen the dragon's head, and it had no use for him. The pull of the road, which had been an addiction for so long, finally snapped. It was time to turn for home. Not as a triumphant explorer, but as a weary man who had seen too much, carrying the weight of a world that no one back home would ever believe. So he turned his back on China. The journey home wasn't an adventure. It was a long, weary trudge back through a world he now knew too well. He retraced his steps, but this time with a different perspective. Every caravanserai, every port city, held the ghost of his younger self. The naive scholar who had set out from Tangier with no idea what he was in for. Now, he was a middle-aged man, his body worn down by decades of dysentery, shipwrecks, and sleeping on the ground. The novelty was gone, replaced by a grim familiarity with every form of discomfort the medieval world could offer. The news that trickled along the trade routes was a chronicle of a world moving on without him. The political maps had been redrawn. Sultans he had known were dead. Empires had crumbled further. And the Black Death, the shadow he had raced ahead of on his way east, had now swept through the lands he was returning to. He was traveling back through a graveyard. Arriving in Damascus, a city that had once been a bustling jewel, was a shock. He found a place hollowed out by the plague, its population decimated, its famous markets quiet. The grandeur he remembered was now just a shell, haunted by loss. The road had taken its toll, not just on him, but on the entire world. The final leg, back through Egypt and across North Africa, was the most psychologically difficult. He was so close, yet each mile felt longer than the last. The landscape became more familiar, the dry air, the language, the architecture. But he was a stranger in what should have been home. He had been gone for nearly 3 decades. The boy who had left was dead, replaced by this weathered, cynical traveller. When he finally crossed back into Morocco and reached Tangier, there was no triumphant parade. He was simply back. The smells of home were the same, but they now felt small and provincial. The familiar was somehow alien. The journey had fundamentally broken his ability to ever just be from one place. There was one last bittersweet calm interlude. Standing in the courtyard of his family's home, perhaps smelling the same orange blossoms he remembered from his youth, he had a moment of pure, unadulterated memory. For a second, the 30 years of filth, fear, and exhaustion fell away, and he was just a young man in his hometown again. But the moment was fleeting. The scars on his feet, the ache in his bones, the memories of 100 near-death experiences, they all rushed back in. He was home, but the road had come with him. It lived in him now. The final accounting wasn't about the miles travelled or the kings he'd met. It was about the sheer, grinding cost of survival. He had gained a knowledge of the world that no one else possessed, but he had lost the ability to ever feel truly safe, clean, or comfortable ever again. So what did it all amount to? The Reeler, the book he dictated, isn't a triumphant epic. It's the world's longest, most detailed TripAdvisor review from hell. It's a record of survival against a relentless onslaught of biohazards. The true cost of his curiosity was 30 years of his life spent in a state of near constant discomfort, danger, and filth. The romantic image of the lone wanderer is a fantasy. The reality is a man sleeping in his own sweat, eating questionable stew, and praying he doesn't get dysentery again before the next town. The road isn't glamorous. It's just a very long, very unpleasant biohazard, and Ibn Battuta was its most dedicated chronicler. Let me know in the comments which stop on his journey sounds the most miserable to you. Subscribe for more true stories of historical misery.